Yes, your eyes do not deceive you. This is a gravel bike with a suspension fork. WTF, I know. This, of course, is a brand new RockShox Rudy suspension fork, launched as part of their new Explore range with new gearing, reverb, dropper post, and other products as well. And in this video, I'm going to review the fork and tell you how it performs, tell you what I like and dislike, how it compares to other products in a quite niche category. I'll also tackle the issue of whether you're better off on a hardtail mountain bike, talk about why 90s mountain bikes are always referenced anytime a gravel suspension fork is popped up on social media, and whether it pushes gravel bike too far, is this a limit, how far can they go, or whether it's just enough to make a gravel bike even more exciting, faster, smoother, and more capable than ever before. So quite a lot to talk about. I'm David, you're watching Just Ride Bikes. Let's dive in. So this is a brand new RockShox Rudy gravel suspension fork, and it's not a mountain bike fork cut down for a gravel bike, instead designed from the ground up for the demands and requirements of a gravel bike, and it really shows in the look and design of this new fork. So it's available in two travel options, 30 and 40 millimeters, this being a shorter travel option, clearance for a 50mm tyre on a 700C rim, external cable routing, flat mount disc brakes, 12mm through axles. The internals of the fork borrow heavily from their mountain bike technology. So we have the solo air spring on the left side, then we have the charger damper, the rebound damping, which you can adjust down at the bottom there, and there's a lockout lever on the top. To find out how the new Rudy fork performs, I have it fitted to a Salsa Warbird carbon fibre gravel frame set with accompanying SRAM Explore products that were launched a little while ago. So a new 1044 cassette, the reverb axis dropper seat post, flare drop handlebar, and some very fancy Zip 303 S wheels with the company's own 40mm wide gravel tyres. And on the scales, this bike, for a size 56, without pedals, weighs 9.5 kilograms, which I think you'll agree is pretty lightweight for a gravel bike with a suspension fork. And how does it ride? Well, this is easily one of the fastest gravel bikes I've ever ridden. The speed is just astonishing. It picks up speed so quickly and so easily and maintains that speed over all sorts of terrain, smooth, rough, so easily. And the reason it's so fast and so much fun is largely down to the Rudy suspension fork. Even though that 30mm trail doesn't sound like much, on a trail it makes a big difference. It's smoother, it's faster, there's more traction and there's more control. So it means on well-maintained gravel, you can go faster, you get less impact through the handlebars, and when you're in the woods, you can not shy away from that cheeky little line with roots and rocks, which you might do on a rigid gravel bike. You can tackle it almost as fast, and in some cases faster, than a hardtail mountain bike. Yes, that's right. On some of my trails, this bike is actually faster than the mountain bikes I reviewed over the past couple of years, and I wasn't expecting that. It's also one of the most entertaining gravel bikes I've ridden as well. I just smile and laugh out loud every time I ride this bike. It really is an impressive package. I wanted to say it was a gimmick, they didn't need it, but after riding it for the last month or so, I've changed my mind. I think I need it in my life. It is that good. And although you can still make do with a rigid carbon gravel bike setup, this just transforms the bike into something else without, in my view, stepping on the toes of a hardtail mountain bike. And in many ways, you can flip it around and say, why do you need a hardtail mountain bike when this bike with this fork is so capable? For all of you yelling, just buy a mountain bike already, yes, I hear you, I get it, I know where you're coming from. But for me, there's still a clear line of separation between this and a hardtail mountain bike. Now, depending where you live, a mountain bike might be a better choice, but for many parts of the UK, especially where I live, a gravel bike is perfect for tamer, smoother trails, where a mountain bike is overkill. And the big benefit of this bike is that it's undoubtedly faster than a mountain bike on gravel and definitely on the road. And the bike as well is more versatile for bike packing and that sort of adventure riding. And if you're a roadie coming to this and you haven't ridden a mountain bike in 20 years, this is much more approachable and much more accessible and keeps you within that sort of safety zone of riding a gravel bike on fairly tame trails. A mountain bike is a different kettle of fish if you're not used to them, and while they let you ride more technical, challenging trails, not everybody is up for riding really scary black runs. They want a gravel bike because it makes riding the trails more fun without potentially breaking themselves if they go in too deep. So I do personally believe, I'm not just saying it, I haven't been fed by the manufacturers, it's based on years and years of riding bikes and testing bikes and components, that there is a place for a suspension fork on a gravel bike like this without stepping on the toes of a mountain bike and being very separate things. And while there's overlap in technology, the real difference is in the attitude you take when you ride a gravel bike versus a mountain bike, at least for me personally. I ride a gravel bike very differently to how I ride a mountain bike. And what about the 1990s mountain bike revival question that pops up all the time? Well, let's have a look at one to see. Whoa, that time machine works really well. It's 1996, I'm a spotty teenager, and this is my bike, a GT Zascar with the iconic RockShox Rudy SL fork up front. This is a bike that got me totally hooked into the sport as a teenager, and I've kept it. Admittedly, I haven't used it much in the past 20 years, being tucked away in various garages around the UK, but I kept it as a reminder, but also because I was so attached to it as a teenager, I couldn't bear to sell it. And right now, it serves as a timely reminder of just how far bikes have come, both mountain bikes and gravel bikes. So, is that Salsa Warbird with the RockShox Rudy suspension fork just a 1990s mountain bike? Well, no, clearly it's not. And anybody who says that either hasn't ridden a 90s mountain bike or hasn't ridden one in such a long time, they've forgotten how bad they were. But don't get me wrong, this bike was amazing for the time. It's just, we've had a load of technology development since then and bikes have got better. And when it comes to suspension forks, I remember a time before suspension forks when rigid steel forks were the norm on bikes back in the early 90s. The Rudy SL is an iconic fork if you discount the Amp, the Pace, the Gervin and the Marzocchi Bomber Z1 of course, but still an iconic fork and really shows how RockShox have invested and really focused on suspension technology. This was the pinnacle of the technology at the time, but it was merely a small step on the long journey that mountain bikes have made since the 90s to where they are now, which is quite incredible compared to what we had back in 1996. And I don't believe for a second that gravel bikes are on the same evolutionary path as mountain bikes were back in the 90s. While some bike brands will undoubtedly push the limits, like the Niner as an example, I don't see gravel bikes turning into mountain bikes anytime soon. Like I mentioned earlier, there's a clear line of separation between a gravel bike with a suspension fork and a mountain bike like this or a more modern version. So for me, and hopefully for you at home as well, this puts that whole idea of a gravel bike being a 90s mountain bike to bed once and for all, and we can recognise it for what it is, a gravel bike with a suspension fork and not a reinvented 90s mountain bike, because it clearly isn't. So I'm going to put the bike back in the garage and get back on the Salsa Warbird. Now, I know 30mm might not sound like much, and it might not sound like worth having at all. And there might be an argument for just fitting a bigger tyre and having the comfort from that. But I think there's definitely a place for a big volume tyre and suspension working in combination, allowing you to tune the air pressure and the air pressure of the fork to work in harmony and give you even more benefit than just fitting a bigger tyre. This is already a big tyre, 40mm, and the fork has clearance for a 50. So to add 30mm to a tyre, you have to go to 50, 60, 70mm, which this fork wouldn't clear. And there aren't many gravel bikes that will take a 70mm wide tyre. Some go up to 65, I think my Fairlight goes up to 65. But then you're looking at a mountain bike tyre, and you might be better off looking at a 650B wheel and going to a bigger tyre, fitting a mountain bike tyre, the 2.1 or 2.2. But then you can make the argument you might be better off on a mountain bike if you're fitting mountain bike tyres and wheels to a gravel bike. So I think there's definitely a sweet spot for a 40mm tyre, which is my personal preference for a gravel bike, for a combination of weight, speed and traction with the addition of that suspension. I'm really intrigued to try the longer trail of 40 to see whether it's worth having over the 30 here. Hopefully I'll get a chance in the future. But I definitely think big tyre, bit of suspension works really well, as I found in the past with the Redshift stem, the Lauf fork and the Future Shock from Specialized. Let's talk about how the new RockShox Rudy compares to other products in the market that try and offer the same benefits on a gravel bike. And I've ridden most on the market, so I can talk from experience about how it compares. My first experience of a gravel suspension fork goes right back to 2019 with the original Fox AX. And I had high hopes for it and I was really disappointed. It was just a cut down mountain bike suspension fork and it was heavy, really altered the geometry on the bike. There's clearance with the down tube issues and the damping, the spring just wasn't that good and didn't work that well, and I was glad to send it back. But they are working on a new version of that, but it hasn't been launched just yet. And since then I've ridden other products like the Lauf grip fork, which is a good option. It's lighter, it's a bit cheaper, it looks a bit odd, way more odd than this fork does. And while it works well on kind of washboard gravel, there's no damping because it's just literally carbon springs bouncing up and down. It's a bit of a pogo stick on bigger repeated impacts and isn't anywhere near as controlled as this one is with the damping. And then there are two other products that spring to mind: the Redshift shock stop suspension stem and the Specialized Diverge with the Future Shock. Now firstly, that Redshift stem. You might have seen my review a few weeks ago. I've been testing it for the last couple of months on my own personal Fairlight Sacan, and I reviewed it before the fork came out, or I got my hands on the fork, and I was really impressed with the Redshift. It's fairly affordable. You can add it to any bike, different stem lengths. You can easily tune it with different elastomers inside, and it offers the benefits of comfort really easily to any gravel bike without upsetting the geometry. And then to the Specialized Future Shock, first rolled out on the Roubaix endurance bike, and then to the Diverge gravel bike. It's now in version 2, and I really rate it. It makes the Diverge one of the best gravel bikes on the market in my humble opinion. Like the Redshift, it offers a claimed 20 minutes of travel, and the version 2 offers proper damping, so much more controlled than the original. So over repeated impacts, there's less of that pogo bouncing sensation you can get with some systems, especially at Lauf. Now, what the Redshift and the Future Shock have in common is that they both suspend the rider. So great for comfort, isolating your upper body from an impact coming through the front wheel, the fork and into the frame and handlebars. What the suspension fork does is suspend the frame, the bike and the rider from all the impacts coming through the trail. And what it does is offer you comfort that you get from the Redshift and the Future Shock, but also more control and more traction like suspension does on cars, motorbikes and mountain bikes. And that's the main benefit of this over all those other systems. The other elephant in the room perhaps is the Cannondale Lefty Oliver, but unfortunately I've only ridden that on a very limited basis, so I don't have enough time on that to really get to know it and compare it to this. The main difference on that one is that there's no sag like this one has, so it runs like a rigid fork on the road. So if you're more roady and you're more worried about efficiency, it might be a better option. But I think RockShox have done a better job in using their suspension technology and experience to bring the benefits to a gravel bike like this one here. And as odd as it looks more normal than a lefty fork with half a leg missing. Before I sum up this review, let me give you some handy pros and cons in a bite-sized takeaway verdict of this fork. So the pros, the performance is utterly impressive. It's smooth and you don't notice it working, but you notice the benefits it provides in terms of control, comfort and capability. It's dead easy to set up. Got an air spring valve on the left side there, use a shock pressure pump and use the recommended settings from RockShox and you get to a really good place very easily. For smoother gravel or road sections and climbing and sprinting, there's a handy lockout lever so you can firm it up nicely. If you do leave it open all the time, it's very controlled and you really don't notice it working. There's no excessive bobbing doesn't bob up and down when you're climbing out of the saddle or sprinting along the gravel. It's just very controlled and well mannered. Despite such a small amount of travel, it doesn't bottom out at all. I've not noticed a thud or thunk from it bottoming out on a rock or big heavy landing. The axle, the crown length is longer than a rigid carbon fork, but only by 20 millimeters. And on this bike, it hasn't adversely affected the geometry. So the handlebars aren't up in the clouds. It feels very much a race bike like this bike is designed to be. And perhaps most controversially, I like the looks of the fork. I'd probably go for the black version over this desert sand colour, but I like the slim legs, tapered at the ends, low profile crown, just a good looking fork, and I think it looks good on a gravel bike and doesn't look out of place at all. And let's have some downsides, and the first one is the looks. Yes, I know, I just said it looks good, but it doesn't look as slender, as sleek as a rigid carbon fork. So there's that. And then there's a weight. At just over 1.2 kilograms, it's quite a bit heavier than a rigid carbon fork, which is probably about 500 to 600 grams. But as I've hopefully covered in this video, the weight is easily offset by the performance it offers. Then there's the price. At just over £700, I'll put a price down below. It's quite expensive, and I know the price puts it out of reach for many people, but for me, I'm already working on how I can find some money to buy one because I do like it that much. So the performance for me does justify the price, although I'm not justifying that high price tag. It is expensive, I know. The other potential concern is maintenance, and I know it's adding more complexity to a gravel bike, and many people love the simplicity and the low maintenance of a gravel bike, especially if you're going bike packing, right in the middle of nowhere, far away from a blacksmith or bike shop. So there is that. But RockShox have been doing suspension forks for 30 years now, and they know what they're doing. So that builds on all that technology and proven reliability. And personally speaking, I've got a few very old mountain bike suspension forks in my garage on old bikes that have never been serviced, and they still work just fine. So for me, I don't have any concerns around the maintenance and reliability of this going forward, but I know that will be an issue for many of you. But long-term testing will be the ultimate decider of that. I've only had a month with it. Hopefully I can get my hands on one for longer term testing, put it through a British winter and see how it copes with mud and being ridden every day, which I do. So little question mark there perhaps. Time to sum up my thoughts on this new RockShox Rudy suspension fork then. And I think if it wasn't clear already, that I really like this fork. It makes the bike smoother, faster, and much more capable than a rigid setup. So I'm sold on it. But I think it's probably fair to say it's probably overkill for many gravel cyclists. There's the weight, the extra length, complexity, maintenance, and then the price. The price, in my opinion, is the only downside to this product, although it's cheaper than buying a new Specialized Diverge with a Future Shock. Do I see a future where all gravel bikes have a suspension fork? Probably not, it's fair to say. The price will probably see to that. And many people don't like the idea of extra complexity on their gravel bikes. They like the simplicity of a nice carbon or steel rigid fork. But if you like technology and you like the extra performance benefits you get from a suspension fork, and if you look at mountain bikes, they all have suspension forks, even at the cheaper end of the market these days, then the benefits of this fork definitely outweigh all the negatives in my mind. So yes, colour me impressed. I'm really taken with it. And this whole bike is just phenomenal. I'm already trying to work out how I can keep this bike, how I can raise the funds, keep the bike, because the frame, the fork, and the gearing works extremely well. It's such a fast and fun bike to ride. I have to admit, I do love it quite a bit. It's been a lot of fun to ride. Everything from a cyclocross race to a 100-kilometre gravel ride to just thrashing the local woods and gravel routes and lots of road in between as well. It does it all so well. Anyway, those are my thoughts, my view on riding the new RockShox Rudy suspension fork. Definitely not a gimmick like many people might think, and this definitely isn't a 90s mountain bike reincarnated. It's so much more than that and so much better. But of course, let me know what you think down below by leaving a comment. Are you loving it? Are you hating it? Love to hear your thoughts as always. But that's all for now. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you all again very soon.